should Mr. Putin reach for those types of weapons, he will be annihilated within half a day. Even if it doesn't happen, China will draw a red line and tell Moscow not to take that route. So I think we're now seeing Western leaders get over that fear. I think they've come to realize that Mr. Putin is quite the con man when he makes threats to use nuclear weapons or strike Western targets. He's not the strong man that he projects himself inside of Russia, and I think they're coming to realize that.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we're talking to a Ukraine-based global affairs analyst with more than 2 decades experience in humanitarian work and international journalism. Michael Bociurkiv is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and has been a spokesperson for the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He's also an author and a regular commentator for many international media outlets. Michael, welcome back. Good to see you again. Now, Michael, you've been in New York for an annual media conference focusing on Ukraine. News reporting has concentrated recently on the Russian incursions and advances in the Kharkiv region. Now, the Ukrainian military have complained consistently they might have been able to do more to defend themselves against those attacks had they been allowed to fire NATO-supplied weapons into Russian territory, like ATACMS, for example. If and when that ban is lifted, because there is a report in the New York Times that may be imminent, how significant is it?
Sure. Good to be with you. Well, I think it does fall into the category of a game changer because Ukraine has long since the start of the war claimed that it needs to have the capability to strike legitimate military targets deep inside Russia. The kind of, military bases where those long-range missiles that are destroying Kharkiv and other Ukrainian cities day in and day out are launched from. So there's also a kind of eagerness in Ukraine to take out bigger targets like the Kerch Strait Bridge, which a lot of the military supplies comes over that. Up until now, they've been managing to poke holes into it, so to speak. But this is a big deal. I think up until now, there's been a nervousness in Western capitals about Ukraine's strike capability deeper inside Russia because, there's fears that this would prompt more retaliation from Russia. Well, we can't have a war like this where the party being attacked is like a David and Goliath fight, where Ukraine has one arm kind of tied behind its back. So longer range and more powerful warheads will give Ukraine a huge capability. And I think finally will act as a deterrent as well, because the time has come where this cannot be sustained, that Ukrainian cities, especially energy infrastructure, is being attacked day in and day out. Kyiv needs the capability to take those out.
And it's the fear of escalation that's held back such a move so far. Russia has renewed its threat that it will retaliate, it says, on British targets if Ukraine uses British weapons to strike Russian territory. That's after remarks made by the Foreign Secretary David Cameron, suggesting he saw it as legitimate. How seriously should those threats be taken?
Well, I think the big fears in Western capitals, including in London, is that if things do escalate, Mr. Putin will be tempted to follow through on his threat to use tactical nuclear weapons. But we just spoke, my Global Impact show co-host and I, Melissa Ritchie, the other day with Ukraine's top diplomat to the UN, Sergei Koslitsa, and his thinking, he made this point very clearly that should Mr. Putin reach for those types of weapons, he will be annihilated within half a day. Even if it doesn't happen, China will draw a red line and tell Moscow not to take that route. So I think we're now seeing Western leaders get over that fear. I think they've come to realize that Mr. Putin is quite the con man when he makes threats to use nuclear weapons or strike Western targets. He's not the strong man that he projects himself inside of Russia, and I think they're coming to realize that.
Because a naval ship was sunk just days ago in Sevastopol, according to British intelligence, using precision ATACMS. And there's been no serious escalation yet. All we've seen is apparent tactical nuclear weapons exercises in Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine. So empty threats, do you think that's proof that these threats are empty?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've said this many times on air. I think Ukrainian officials, as well as Western leaders who are pleading with taxpayers to give them the ability to fund the war in Ukraine, have to make the argument much, much, much stronger that, look, this is a real deal that we're getting in terms of arming Ukraine. For 3%, let's say, of the annual US military budget, Ukraine has been able to destroy about 50% of conventional Russian military capability. And above and beyond that, they managed to destroy about 30% of the Black Sea fleet and also force the Russians to move ships from Sevastopol to safer waters, hence opening up crucial grain corridors for the world market. So I think if this message begins to get through to Western audiences, I think leaders will have an easier job selling this aid to Ukraine.
And just how much attention do the battlefield and political developments get in the US at the moment?
Sadly, it's falling off the radar quite a bit. I mean, with the elections coming up in November, lots of coverage of Trump's daily charades in the courtrooms. The Israel-Gaza conflict. It's tough to keep that type of a story in the headlines. But, as you referenced at the top, we just had a Ukrainian journalism conference here in New York City. And a lot of the analysts there said Ukraine has to do a kind of better job to humanize the story. Who are the Ukrainians above and beyond those fighting at the front line? And what do they stand for? And also personalizing stories is very important as well. So I think if the Ukrainians and outlets can do more of that type of coverage, the message will get further to Western audiences.
There is right now harrowing footage filmed by drone coming out of the town of Vovchansk, some 45 miles from Kharkiv. It's been heavily bombed, with Russian soldiers being sent in relentlessly to replace those that have been killed. It's being razed to the ground, bodies in the streets. How urgent is that situation to get that out, people to see that, and to stop it suffering the same kind of fate as Mariupol, for example?
Yeah, it's so heartbreaking to see this, and what we're seeing playing out in places like Mariupol and Kharkiv Oblast is what Ambassador Koslitsa told us the other day, is that the destruction is on a level far, far worse than, for example, what the Nazis did in their advance into Eastern Europe, where it's scorched earth tactics. And right now, Kharkiv, the second biggest city in Ukraine, a center of politics, of learning, and of culture, is being very, very badly hit. The one kind of piece of the story we can't really put together yet is a few months ago, actually in February, when President Zelensky gave his 2-year press conference, he was asked by the Ukrainian media, so what of all of these millions of dollars that were supposed to go to building defenses to stop the advance of the Russians? And he said, well, it's being deployed, it's being worked on. But as the BBC reported just a few days ago, there were pockets where Russian troops just walked over the Ukrainian-Russia border with no kind of lines of defense whatsoever. So I've also read comments by some Ukrainian military commanders that where did these millions of dollars go that were meant to build these defenses? So what Ambassador Koslitsa also told us is if Kharkiv is going to be properly defended, they need a minimum of 2 Patriot missile batteries immediately. That's the other thing that we can't really put together here is why is this aid that was approved already quite some time ago, why is it taking so long to get into Ukrainian hands?
The need indeed is absolutely desperate. How long do you think Russia will or can sustain this kind of onslaught, though? Well,
the argument has to be made, and again, Ambassador Koslitsa made this very clear, is that actually it's the first time a Ukrainian official has said this. He said that, and again, this is Ukraine's top diplomat to the United Nations, he said that the Russian economy has shown a resilience that none of us had expected. The replacement, for example, of the Minister of Defense from Shoigu, who is known for siphoning money very, very badly out of the defense system, has been replaced by a technocrat economist who is probably going to make this kind of military economy even stronger and more resilient. Sanctions have limited shelf life. The best ones probably have 1.5 years at best. And the Russians have been able to do great workarounds with the help of former Soviet states, Uzbekistans and Kazakhstans of the world, as well as allies like India and China, who are buying Russian oil and other energy products. So it's a big concern. My view on this is that when it comes to the point where the average Russian, or especially the elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg, if they really feel the bite of sanctions, they feel the isolation, they won't be able to travel to Dubai and the Maldives and elsewhere, that's when the kind of rubber hits the road and there'll be much, much more pressure on Mr. Putin to do something, perhaps even bring an end to the war.
And on the subject of money, there was a meeting in Italy this week of G7 finance ministers. It's expected to discuss the legality of handing an extra 30 billion euros in seized Russian state assets by way of a loan to Ukraine to help reconstruct or buy arms. Yet again, it's very, very slow progress in trying to release any of this money that's been seized. But could it make a significant difference and set a precedent?
Absolutely. And we have to remind everyone that the bulk of that money, those seized sovereign funds from Russia, is in Europe. It's not here in the United States or in Canada. So it's very important that the Belgians, especially, which are hosting Euroclear, pave the way for at least the interest from those billions of frozen dollars to go to Ukraine. And I think this is the way things have to go, because if you take talk to the average person here in the United States about the war in Ukraine, they have other concerns on their mind, and they can't understand why their taxpayers' money is going to fund the war in Ukraine. And if Trump gets in, God forbid, it's going to become much more difficult to get aid to Ukraine. Hence, I think more of the responsibility has to move to the European continent. After all, it's much closer to the war. But again, that's where much of these assets are frozen. And look, we all understand the concern of Belgium and others that this may call into question the reputation of, Euroclear and of the reliability of the euro. But what's worse, having a bit of a dent to your reputation, or Mr. Putin being allowed to go further into Europe, damaging economies, creating havoc worldwide. The other thing I'll quickly say is that the Russians have developed a very, very, I would say, even impressive playbook of causing chaos around the world, destabilizing democracies without firing one shot. Things these days can be done by cyber attacks and other means, undermining elections, that sort of thing. So we cannot, as a civilized society, let our eye off the ball here. We have to do everything it takes to push Mr. Putin back.
And just to go back to that what you were talking about before, about this scorched earth kind of tactic policy, whatever you want to call it. You've said earlier that Putin, you can't underestimate his thirst for territorial expansion. How much of the country do you think he is prepared to destroy in the process of this war?
Well, it's a very good question. It sends a chill down my back just to think of it. Look, I'm normally based in Odesa, a beautiful city which was built by many different nationalities, and which is, at the end of the day, a crucial component of the global food supply chain. We see almost on a daily basis now Russian missiles and drones coming our way, and it's caused a lot of panic, a lot of anxiety. And I'm really sad to tell you this, but people in Odesa who have been part of the building of modern Odesa, or the foundation of it, are either leaving or thinking of leaving. And I think the Russians know exactly what they're doing by these scare tactics. So it's not only scorched earth policies or approaches, it's also causing fear and panic throughout the country. The Russians are also developing new tactics. When they do fire drones and missiles, they basically take a circuitous route around Ukraine. So they set off alarm bells throughout the country, including in the middle of the night. And that causes a lot of disruption. We only have to look what the Russians have done in other theaters, for example, in Syria and Chechnya and elsewhere, to know how far Mr. Putin will go. This is a regime that doesn't think twice about even killing its own people for its own purposes and blaming it on others. So he's not to be underestimated. But it is very, very sad. Again, going back to Kharkiv to see what is going on in this beautiful city, just so much destruction, and nothing is off the table for the Russians. Churches, museums, places of worship, civilian apartment buildings. It's very, very sad.
Yeah, and how further does that ambition go? How far does it extend to including the erasing of civilians' culture, identity in Ukraine? I mean, you were talking earlier about how at that conference that you've been at, you were saying it's really important to show the Ukrainian people who they are and what they are. I presume that's like a countermeasure to what you see is going on in Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah, well, what was said at that conference as well is that we are seeing history repeat itself in Ukraine. Russian aggression, the liquidation of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, the forced man-made famine under Stalin of 1932-33. That is happening right now. We had a session, for example, on ecocide, what Russia is doing to the environment in Ukraine, blowing up dams, mining agricultural fields on a scale never seen before, chemical attacks, cluster bombs, you name it. It's causing massive destruction to the environment in Ukraine, which will take generations for it to recover. So I think that's has to be a key part of kind of the Ukrainian strategy, is to bring to life these attacks and how they impact upon people, how they're destroying the culture. We also had a session, by the way, of what happens behind the scenes in seized territory, for example, in the Donbass, how the Russians have a very, very developed playbook of changing curriculums and replacing Ukrainian radio and TV with their own channels. So it's something that is happening on a kind of industrial scale in Ukraine, but not very well understood by the West.
What do you think the West needs to understand about it?
Well, I think they need to understand is the brutality, the extent to which Russia will go. Let me give you an example, if I may. I mean, I remember in the first few months of the war, we saw the attacks starting on Mariupol, for example, that theater where women and children were taking shelter. Hundreds died in a Russian strike there. But it was that particular strike on a maternity hospital in Mariupol, which was apocalyptic in nature. It was probably a 500-pound bomb that landed on the grounds of that hospital. And you saw that kind of iconic image now of a pregnant mother being taken out on a stretcher. She ended up dying, and so did her child. I look at that photo and I want to vomit. It's just so horrible. But the reason it gets me so angry is because you would have thought that that would have been a red line way back earlier in the war. But we're seeing red line after red line after red line being crossed, and this only emboldens not only Mr. Putin, but other autocrats as well. Where does it end, and how far? I guess at the end of the day, what people should understand is that the type of destruction, apocalyptic destruction we're seeing in Ukraine, if Mr. Putin is not restrained, he will bring that level of destruction to other neighboring countries. That will, if it's a NATO country, that will require U.S. and other allied troops on the ground, and will become much, much more costlier.
When you talk about red lines being gone over again and again and again, as a person yourself who has a keen interest in humanitarian work and by extension, I believe, human rights, one of the most overlooked tragedies of the war is this treatment of children forcibly removed from Ukraine to Russia. Why is it the world seemingly is numb to this, and there hasn't been more of an outcry and outrage about it?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Look, I'm a former global spokesperson for UNICEF. I represented UNICEF in the West Bank and Gaza. And, that's a type of ongoing burning conflict, which has peaks and lows, if you want to call it that. And I remember very well, way back then in the day, telling people what children are going through in that particular crisis. And there are many reasons that this numbness has, if we want to call it that, has taken over. But I think one reason is that those who are supposed to be speaking out on behalf of children's rights have kind of lost the microphone. And I don't think they're making the argument forcefully enough. But going back to the situation in Ukraine, it's children's catastrophe by any way you look at it. Not only the forced deportation of thousands and thousands of children to Russia, where they are forcibly adopted, where they're forcibly brought into this very Russian patriotic curriculum, but also what they're facing on the ground in Ukraine, the disruption to their education, the disruption to their play. There was one video we played at the conference that everyone saw, and it was about it showed a boy, perhaps 10 years old, being interviewed by a TV reporter just after his playground had been struck by a Russian missile. And he said, I never thought I'd see the day that this would happen to my own play area. I saw the destruction of Bucha, of churches there, but now it's happening to us. And that look in his eyes, the tone of his voice is something I've seen in other conflict areas, for example, in the Gaza Strip. And it's so sad because overnight, these young, innocent, beautiful children are being forced to take on kind of the demeanor of an adult. You can see the darkness in their eyes as well, but also, you realize that their youth has been abruptly brought to an end, and what kind of future are they going to face? And one more point, I spend so much time in Ukraine, and I go to cemeteries on purpose to see, for example, how much they've expanded over the course of a few months, and some of them have reached capacity. If you go to many villages in Ukraine, there are no men there anymore. If you travel throughout Europe or even here in the United States, you see Ukrainian mothers and their children on the go seeking safe shelter. So I make this point because imagine what it's doing underneath the surface to the social fabric of Ukraine, these split up of families. And again, this is not something that is going to bounce back overnight once hopefully there's a peace deal. So it's very, very sad to watch.
It's really interesting because there are going to be these peace talks in Switzerland taking place next month. And Zelensky is urging countries like China to take part. At those peace talks, it seems strange that there is a concept of having peace talks at this point. But is it more about what do you do afterwards, about the reconstruction? What kind of things might be talked about there?
Yeah, I think this is a meeting where we probably keep our expectations low, but hope for the best. 160 countries were invited. I think we're at over 50 now that have accepted. The Ukrainians in the host country are putting forth a very deliberate effort to attract countries from the global south, but it doesn't look like Brazil will be taking part. China probably won't be at the table. I'm unsure about India, South Africa. We're talking about members of that BRICS coalition. It's very, very important that they be there. Ukraine has somewhat belatedly put emphasis on working more on the global south, getting African countries involved, Central South American countries, because at the end of the day, a lot of these issues are voted on, for example, in the UN General Assembly and in subcommittees and things like that. So it's very important to have them as part of this. But it's going not too badly. Half of the countries that are going to be attending are non-European countries. We're also going to be watching out at what is going to be the level of representation of the respective countries. There's talk that this happening so soon after the G7 summit in Italy that perhaps President Biden will detour and attend the summit as well. So this isn't going to be remarkable if we're not at least at the level of foreign ministers or leaders of the representative countries. But whether it will end up in a sudden peace for Ukraine, I doubt it. Russia is not going to be at the table. But it will signal to the Kremlin, to Moscow, that these countries that are attending, and again, hopefully at a very high level, are in support of Ukraine, are in support of a peace treaty. And then, China, I said this the other day, Xi Jinping is one of the few global leaders that has the ability to pick up the phone, call Mr. Putin and say, bring an end to this now. China has not done that. China can't even bring itself to call this for what it is, a war. They call it a crisis, the Ukraine crisis. So it's very, very important that China have a look at itself in the mirror and start calculating the cost to world instability, to grain corridors, that sort of thing, and take a more principled stance.
Isn't it, though, more urgent for Ukraine's allies to agree what victory should look like and define a strategy to get there so that all its allies can get behind it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the Zelensky government has a 10-point peace plan that includes the complete withdrawal of Russian troops, the return of POWs, territory to be returned. The Ukrainians have, and very, very understandably, quite a strong position, and that is that all of these territories have to be that are occupied have to be returned to Ukraine, including Crimea. Many analysts don't see that happening. And I think the Russians, their strategy is kind of a war of attrition. They want to wear down Ukraine. They want to wear down the West so that eventually they have a stronger position at the bargaining table. But I asked, again, Ambassador Koslitsa, if he had the opportunity, like the Palestinians and the Israelis did way back in Oslo, to go into a room together, put aside their differences, and talk about a path to peace. He said, well, I'm actually doing that most days. I'm in, the UN General Assembly or in the Security Council, and I see Russia right there. But his answer, I agree with him, said, well, we could talk, but at the end of the day, it's the kind of attitude, the mindset of the Russian people that isn't going to change, that they allow their government to do this type of aggressive behavior. So there's a lot of different aspects to achieving a path to peace. I think also Turkey, their role is going to be very, very important, as a broker, not only as a key kind of negotiator for peace between the Russians and the Ukrainians, but also as a guarantor for peace as well.
I just wanted to ask you, because last time we spoke, you said you were very interested in documenting Russia's influence and growing influence in Africa. What have you seen since we last spoke?
Yeah, sure. Well, my goodness, it's on many, many different levels. For example, I was in South Africa, as you know, and you listen to the radio there, and a lot of the channels are just parroting what Mr. Putin said or what Russia Today said. We find that happening, by the way, very heavily in South America, where Russian propagandistic media channels have a very, very big influence. So there's that, but there's also the Russian race, interestingly, kind of in competition with China, to get to to get to African mineral resources, blood diamonds, that sort of thing, because these are exactly the sorts of things that fund the Putin war machine. The one thing I haven't been able to get a grasp on since that failed attempt by the Wagner Group to take over Moscow is to what degree has the billion-dollar machinery that the Wagner Group had to mine minerals in Russia, how much that's been disrupted by the assassination of their leader, Mr. Prigozhin. But you do have other entities connected to the Russian state, for example, through Gazprom, which are keeping that flow of money going. So a lot of Russian influence there. And of course, they have much, much more resources diplomatically to manipulate and to pressure and to threaten smaller, weaker African countries to vote a certain way, for example, in the BRICS setting or in the UN General Assembly. So huge influence there, and sadly, again, Ukraine is a bit late at the game in terms of putting itself forward more robustly on the continent and, developing friendships with potential allies there.
When you talk about Ukraine being a bit late to put itself out there, how much power, how much freedom do the media outlets in Ukraine have now, and how evolved are they?
Yeah, very good question. Well, look, we went into this war with a very poor state of affairs for the Ukrainian media. A lot of the main TV channels were owned by oligarchs, and a lot of the media channels did not have stable sources of revenue. Then the war came, martial law was declared, and the Zelensky administration kind of corralled the main channels into what's called a 24/7 telemarathon, which has served its purpose in terms of getting information out. But ratings have really fallen, and none of these channels are making revenue. The war has been absolutely so destructive on the media sector in Ukraine. We talked about this a lot at our Ukrainian journalist conference. For example, there's a huge human resource problem. Many journalists have been killed, well over 100. Many have been drafted or at the front line. Many have gone there to volunteer, and many have left Ukraine for safer haven. The number of newsrooms that have closed across the country are in the hundreds now. And also there's been massive destruction of physical infrastructure. So our argument, or our kind of effort right now, is to help boost the Ukrainian media sector to help them raise revenue, to set standards, and also to help them deal with their human resource problems. So we're looking at a number of things, creating alliances, for example, between Ukrainian journalism schools and schools here in the United States, for example, like Columbia. But we're also making the argument there's going to be another Ukraine reconstruction conference next month in Munich. And it boggles the mind that at none of these conferences the Ukrainian media sector is brought up. But our argument is that for all of these billions and billions of dollars to come into Ukraine for reconstruction, we first need a very strong, viable, independent media sector, because that's how corruption will be kept at bay. And by the way, businessmen, the last time I checked, need reliable information to make sound investments in a certain country. So we feel this is something that can be done fairly simply and fairly quickly while a peace deal is being forged ahead. It's very, very important that happen.
Because it's also really important, I presume, that the messaging and the information, the control over the information war about how the war is going in Ukraine, who has the upper hand, who has the advantage, and the perception of that's going to heavily influence long-term support for Ukraine, and perhaps have an influence on, and we know that Putin is playing on this to make it look like, well, if we stick it out long enough, they're just going to give up. I mean, that whole messaging is absolutely crucial, isn't it?
It is, and the public opinion polling in Ukraine has indicated that actually most people in Ukraine would like the Zelensky administration to be more forthright, not sugarcoat everything as much as they did, so they can get a better grasp. I'll give you an example of that 2-year war anniversary press conference. Mr. Zelensky pegged the number of Ukrainian servicemen dead. I think it was around 31,000. A lot of people believe that number to be far, far higher. I think in terms of messaging, the Ukrainians have to do a better job, tinker with their messaging to say, this is actually what's happening. This is the level of destruction. Journalists have long since complained that their access to the front line is quite restricted. The penalties for Ukrainian media to overstep martial law reporting regulations are very, very severe. So it's imposed a kind of attitude of self-censorship, especially with Ukrainian media. But this is the reality of the world we live in, is that unfortunately people really have to see destruction up close and very vividly to make an impact. And I hope that message gets through.
And just finally, Michael, you've described yourself as an honorary citizen of Odessa, which you've made your home. How is life there now? How optimistic are your fellow citizens about it and Ukraine's future?
Yeah. Whenever I go back to Odessa, and I can't wait to go back, I am just, amazed by the level of civility, of kindness that are shown to people like myself. Even during this time of war, I told you about how these air raid sirens keep people awake through the night. But they have taken it on board. They realize that this is part of warfare, that we have to keep on going. We have to keep our businesses alive. A lot of people hope that, tourism will eventually start coming back to that region. It's very, very important. So people are very resilient. But having said that, there are very, very strong people that I referred to earlier in the interview who have to take a break and are leaving. And I do fear that this will have a kind of a cumulative effect on the economy there. A lot of Ukrainians are, when they wake up in the middle of the night and they hear these Russian missiles go off and drones over their heads, they go, where is the Western support? Where are those Patriot missile systems that are meant to defend us? And everyone in Odessa realizes that they are living in a port city. This port city, as I said, is a crucial component of the global food supply chain. And why is it that the West has not even given a fraction of the aid, of the defense that it's given to the Red Sea to protect those shipping lanes? Why isn't it doing the same for these very crucial grain corridors? Having said that, there is good news to share with you. I mean, the last time I was at the port, not that long ago, there were a lot of ships lined up carrying grain, but for the first time since the start of the war, containers are starting to be moved as well. And of course, this is really, really important because Ukrainian roads and rail systems are overwhelmed with container traffic. If they can shift a lot of that back, it will not only improve Ukraine's economy, trade, impact positively world markets, but it also bring a lot more employment back to Odesa. When you live there as long as I do, you realize how far the tentacles go throughout the city of that port, that it's the lifeblood of Odesa in many ways. So that is something that is really, really great to see, is that revival of that port.
Michael, really good to catch up with you. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.